Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins one very dark evening. An important event was taking place in a beautiful and expensive estate where almost all the aristocrats of the empire had gathered. And the girl who was the maid of the imperial princess Rulicia Router was also invited. She, in contrast to her everyday work uniform, was wearing an incredibly luxurious dress that day. And so, while she had been standing to the side for almost the entire evening, a very attractive man suddenly approached her and greeted her. He extended his hand forward and said that he had thought it would be her, and then asked if she would like to give him her dance that evening. The man looked no less luxurious. He was wearing a beautiful uniform as well as a lot of different jewelry, and this man turned out to be the Duke's eldest son, Kyle Lockhart. The other girls, when they started watching his actions from the side, immediately started to discuss it. Of course, they thought he was simply stunning. However, they were also outraged by the fact that for some reason he decided to invite some low-class servant to dance. Rulicia herself, meanwhile, having folded her fan and asked for forgiveness, said that she was very sorry, but she would have to say it. However, she simply asked if he could leave her. The girl said these words with a smile and a very casual look. When the Duke's son heard this, he was very surprised and even wounded to the heart. The people around him began to whisper, as they had not expected to hear such a thing from a maid. He, in turn, turned to Lady Roth and said that he apologized if he had caused her any inconvenience, but simply wanted to clear up any misunderstandings. So he asked if they could go away and talk alone to find out everything he wanted to know. The girl, meanwhile, continued to smile and said that it was rather strange, because she was absolutely sure that she had asked him to leave, but for some reason he was still standing in front of her. Rulicia also asked what he could possibly say to her if he couldn't even hear her request the first time. The man came closer to her and, bowing, asked her to give him a chance. But she was indignant. Then in a quiet voice asked him not to play games with her. In the same quiet voice, the girl said that she knew everything about his hidden motives and even called him a monster. Lockhart at this point put on a very casual expression and asked what ulterior motives were involved. Why, he said, even though they may serve different masters, that is no reason why they cannot be friends. He continued to approach the poor girl closer and closer and asked if her heart would melt if he even knelt before her. But the girl continued to be indignant. In the same quiet voice, she asked if he really didn't understand what was going on. Then, pointing toward the crowd, she explained that everyone was looking at them. So, already raising the intonation of her voice, she told him to leave immediately and leave her alone. But this guy was quite persistent. He continued to stand in his place and asked her how about inviting her to dinner, and also added that if she agreed, he would leave her immediately. Rulicia was even more indignant about this. She couldn't understand whether he was really inviting her to a fancy restaurant in broad daylight, where there would be many noblemen who had nothing better to do than discuss other people's personal lives. But he wasn't at all embarrassed. He said that was exactly it. He thought this restaurant would be a good choice. So he also added that he would send a carriage for her. But the girl continued to say that she did not want people to think that she had betrayed Her Highness's trust and fallen in love with him. At that moment, he smiled maliciously and said that in that case she could go her own way. But if she didn't mind, he would like to expose her fraud immediately. She smiled awkwardly and said that he was simply the most terrible person, and also added that if someone heard him, they would definitely understand everything differently than it really is. He bowed before leaving and told her to just call him Lockhart. After all, she spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear, and it was okay if she started shouting because he really liked her dramatic voice and wanted to hear it more often. But Rulicia laughed and asked him to stop being so intrusive and ignorant. The guy thought for a moment about these words. Afterwards, he smiled and asked if she had really just called him clingy. But immediately after that, he got down on one knee and, kissing her hand, said that it was not for nothing that they called him the lion cub of Tager, because he would definitely be able to destroy her if he needed to. It also doesn't matter to him at all what it takes to achieve this. He always achieved his goals when he wanted. As soon as the girl heard that he wanted to destroy her, she was at first stunned, but she quickly got her emotions under control and, smiling, said that she would like to see how he was going to do it. In fact, when Rulisha was still very young, she and her mother lived in a small hut located in the Tunbar Mountains. After her mother returned from the mountains one day with herbs, she took them to the pharmacy and exchanged them for money, which they could use to live. However, something terrible also happened at that moment, and all because the path to her house through the village was not an ordinary walk in the park. Whenever she returned home, the bully boys would hit her with stones and sticks and say many offensive words. One of them was that they called her crazy, just like her father. Of course, Rulitia was incredibly offended by this, because the word father always came up in the worst situations. That's why she never wanted to know who her father was, and she also didn't want to meet him. Rulicia's mother was the only comfort she had in that world. And even on the day she came home with her forehead bleeding from the rocks the children had thrown at her, it was her mother who comforted her until she was calm enough to just fall asleep. And after the girl had cried in her warm arms, she saw her mother quietly sobbing in the living room that same evening, and this caused her incredible pain. The girl did not know why she was crying. She assumed it was because she was beaten by other children, or because she was called an orphan. She also assumed that most likely her mother was crying because she herself was crying, but in fact, in this case, the reason was not so important at all. But the main thing was that her mother cried precisely because of Rulisha. She was the only family the girl had, and she simply went and broke the heart of her beloved. And it was precisely because of all these obsessive thoughts that Rulicia could not sleep that night. And when the morning came, her mother, as always, went to the mountains at dawn to pick herbs. But before she left and closed the door behind her, a little girl ran up to her and grabbed her by the cloak. The woman immediately turned to her daughter and was very surprised that Rulicia had woken up quite early. The girl didn't answer. She just looked at her mother with incredibly sad, tear-filled eyes. The woman was silent for a while. Then she stroked her head and asked if she was really that worried about her. When Rulicia didn't answer, the woman told her not to look at her like that, because she would definitely come back. Her mother also replied that if the mountain paths are uneven, it may take several days, but she will always return to her beloved daughter, no matter what. Before leaving, she smiled and asked Rulicia if she could wait for her. The girl immediately said that, of course, she would wait for her impatiently at home. In fact, it was at that moment that Rulicia decided that she would never hurt her mother again, and that she would never make her cry. Some time had passed since her mother had gone to the mountains, and she had to go to the market to get some groceries, since she had run out of everything at home. And when she, as always, returned home with a full basket of groceries, the boys ran up to her again. One of them shouted loudly, almost across the entire street, that she was back again and called her a freak. When Rulicia looked back, she saw that many boys, who were clearly older than her, had already surrounded her from all sides. They had sticks in their hands and continued to mock her, saying that she had returned again, and also calling her a freak, an orphan. One of the guys made fun of her the most and told her to go back to her mountains, and also called her a wild woman. But Rulicia at that moment remembered her mother's tears, which she had seen then, and she became determined to act differently this time. When the boys got tired of just talking, they went into battle, and swinging a stick at her, one guy was very surprised, because everything happened differently than usual. And all because the girl grabbed the stick from the other end before he had time to hit her. Then she spoke, screaming loudly, and told them to leave her alone forever. Otherwise they would regret that they had ever been born into this world. She looked at each bully in turn and said that they were idiots for thinking that they could continue to bully her. However, that was not the case. Rulicia told them to get the hell out of her sight before she killed them all. The boys were really scared. They knew she was being completely serious, so they dropped their weapons and started running away screaming. When Rulicia saw this, she was very surprised. She could not believe that her threat actually worked, and they, scared, just left her alone. Of course, at that moment she was overcome with incredible joy because she had finally won this fight. Immediately after this, she ran back to her home, thinking that she would definitely tell her mother about this incident when she returned. Rulicia thought that in this case her mother would never cry again, and this thought made the girl very happy. Well, even more time had passed since her mother had gone to the mountains. It started snowing heavily outside, and she began to worry incredibly. The girl spent most of her time at the window, looking out for her mother, because 3 days had already passed and she still had not returned. Of course, Rulicia was worried about whether everything was okay with her mother, But when terrible thoughts began to come into her head, she quickly pushed them aside, not understanding why she could even think about it. She knew that her mother had said that she would definitely come back, and that meant that she would come, because never before had a woman broken her promise. And then suddenly, she heard the door open. Rulisha immediately beamed with happiness and ran to the exit, thinking that it was her dear mother. But when she saw some unknown man on the threshold, she immediately stopped. Taking a closer look at him, she immediately realized that this was the main person who was actually giving them this house. The girl immediately panicked and asked what he was doing there. The man looked very sad. He came into the room and said that Rulisha needed to go to the village with him. The girl immediately stepped back and asked why she had to do this, and also asked, does he really know anything about her mother? She also explained that she never returned from the mountains and a lot of time had passed. But the man's voice at that moment became incredibly rough and quiet. He slowly told the little girl that her mother would never come back. Rulisha, upon hearing this, immediately froze in place. She could not believe that this was really true. When the girl was ready and arrived in the village with the man, it seemed to her that she could hear people discussing her situation with her mother from everywhere. All people kept saying was that it was an incredibly big tragedy, and that she must have been found and fallen. People also knew that a hunter had found her lying in the valley and brought her to the village thinking that she would be helped there. But when her body was there, they noticed that she was already dead. The man who brought Rulisha to the city asked where she should go now, and after the funeral, the little girl was given her mother's ashes. When the man asked her this question, she did not answer. She was lost in her thoughts and could not understand anything. They stood like that in silence for a while. Then Rulisha suddenly turned around and started running away, hugging the jug that contained her mother's body. She screamed loudly, asking where else she should go but home, and called him an old fool. One of the men immediately got angry because she called the elder such rude words. He was about to follow her and scold her for it, but the owner of the house stopped him and told him to leave her, because it was already difficult for her. Meanwhile, Rulisha ran along the familiar streets of the city, but it was more automatic. She cried all the time and thought about her mother. She couldn't believe that this had actually happened, because her mother had promised to come back, and everything had turned out so terribly. When Rulisha returned home, it was incredibly cold because she did not even light the fireplace, but only lay on the icy floor and cried. The girl kept thinking about what her mother had said, that she would return home, that she would return to her, no matter what it cost her. She kept thinking about that promise, and also about the fact that she trusted her, believed her mother, that she could handle this job. But in the end, everything was not so. Rulisha thought that she would never trust her again, and also decided that she would never trust anyone else in this life, because no matter what promises close to her made, they would always break them. At the moment when this incredibly great grief happened, she was only 10 years old. She did not even notice how she moved to her bed and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, the girl woke up and suddenly noticed that she was lying in her bed. She immediately began to rub her eyes because they were very swollen due to the fact that she was crying all the time. And then suddenly, Rulisha turned her head to the side and saw some unfamiliar man sitting on a chair next to her bed. Of course, the girl immediately became frightened. She clenched her fists and, looking at him with distrust, asked who he was anyway. The man didn't answer at first. He just sat there silently and watched the girl's behavior with a pitiful look. Then he said her name, but he said a different last name. He said she was Rode. Rulisha, hearing about this, was immediately surprised and said that her name is different. She is Rulisha Robb. But the man continued to insist on his own and said that this was not true at all. Her last name was actually Rode. Then, looking her straight in the eye, he said that he was Count Helidon Rode. And when he saw the surprised expression on Rulisha's face, he said that he was her father. Of course, she didn't want to believe all this, so in a rough voice, starting to shout at this man, she said that this was not so. The man asked in a trembling voice, didn't her mother tell her anything? Then he decided to ask in a different way and said that he wanted to know if she had a father. The girl quickly shook her head from side to side, saying that no, she never had a father, and her mother never had a husband. Rulisha also said that if she had him, they would definitely not live like this, and asked, doesn't he really think so? Count Helidon immediately felt incredibly ashamed of all this. Then he stood up from his chair and, coming closer to her, said that from now on he would take care of her. When the girl heard this, she simply did not want to believe it. She thought that this so-called father had been absent her entire life, and now he wanted to take her in and take care of her. At that moment, she began to cry again, thinking about her mother. It was still hard for her to accept the fact that she had died, and now the girl was left completely alone. Without thinking twice, the man came closer to her, stroked her hair gently, and then pulled her towards him and lightly hugged her to comfort his daughter. For a while, Relisha let her emotions out into the world, but then she calmed down and realized that she didn't like it at all. When the Count noticed that she had calmed down, he immediately smiled and said that she was named after his favorite flower. As soon as she heard about it, she was very indignant. She could not believe that her mother actually named her after some man's favorite flower. Without thinking twice, Relisha looked him straight in the eyes and asked why he abandoned her mother. But before he could say anything, she asked him not to say anything, and also added that the butcher's son Colin was also a bastard of some nobleman. When he heard these words, he immediately felt uncomfortable. He asked her to watch her language. After that, he took something out of his pocket, and holding out a beautiful lace ribbon, asked if she understood what it was. As soon as Relisha saw this, she immediately took the ribbon in her hands and said that her mother really loved to use this. Making his voice quieter and calmer, the man explained that he never left her mother Melia. He also said that one day she secretly left, and although he sent many people to look for her, he could not find her for 10 years. And even then, he did not know that she was pregnant. However, a few days ago, a bouquet of Relisha flowers was delivered to his home, tied with exactly this silky ribbon, and with this he was able to track her down. The man explained that he had once given this ribbon to Melia in the past. Thus he realized that before her death, her mother wanted him to come and accept her into his home. The very next day, the man and Relisha arrived at Count Rhodes' villa. When they got inside, Helidon immediately told her that she could use the room he had brought her to, and that everything inside was now hers. Inviting her forward, he said that her tutor would come to her tomorrow, so until then she could rest peacefully. When Relisha heard about this, she was very surprised and did not understand what kind of tutor this was, and most importantly, what he was needed for. But finally, when the next day came, a woman came to her in the morning and said that she was incredibly glad to meet her, and also introduced herself, saying that her name was Julia. Relisha looked at her with a very sad expression on her face and asked, "Does this mean that she is her tutor now?" The woman, with a smile on her face, said that this was all exactly so, and also added that now she understood that apparently her father had already managed to tell a little about this. However, the girl shook her head from side to side and asked what this tutor was all about. Julia ran closer to her and said that this was a very good question. After that, in her cheerful voice, she asked what kind of teacher she would like to see, and also if the girl would like to know anything about her before they began their lesson. Relisha didn't like this assertiveness at all. She turned away from her, calling her an idiot, and said that she actually asked the question first. When the woman heard this new, incomprehensible word, she immediately asked what it meant, because she had never heard of such insults before. But the girl continued to be dissatisfied and said that it meant what it meant, and asked why she needed to know about it at all. When Julia didn't answer, she asked what kind of teacher wouldn't know such basic curse words, and also asked if she even knew what damn it was. But Julia didn't answer. She just stood in front of the girl for a while and then quickly took and left the room. Relisha, seeing this, immediately became happy as soon as she closed the door, and thought that she was able to win again. She thought that these were not the worst curse words, but the woman was still scared. So Relisha even assumed that she was worried about all this for nothing. And in fact, she didn't mean the true meaning of these words at all. The girl just wanted to show what she could be like if you pester her so much. But at that moment, the door of her room opened, and Julia came in again. After that, she threw a huge pile of books on a small table. Relisha, seeing this, opened her mouth in surprise. She looked at her teacher and asked what this was all about. Julia smiled happily and said that these were imperial dictionaries that were published by the Tagar imperial family. So she suggested that they see together if they could find this strange word idiot in this dictionary so that Julia could understand its meaning. Of course, the girl, hearing this, immediately became scared. She could not understand what the woman was talking about and why she needed it, but she simply had no choice. Her teacher took a chair and sat down next to her. After that, she took a book and said that a dictionary is a collection of precise definitions of words and asked the lady if she could read. Relisha, indignant, immediately said that, of course, she could. Then Julia handed her the book and suggested that in that case, they look up this word of hers together. She eventually found it and began reading its meaning out loud. It said that it was a mildly derogatory term used to describe someone who is wished bad things upon, such as being imprisoned or tortured because of their annoying qualities. When Julia read this, she was immediately very surprised, and looking at the little lady asked, "Does Relisha really want her to go to prison?" The girl immediately replied that this was not the case. Then the teacher asked with a smile on her face, "Does this really mean that she does not agree with the definition of this word given by the Imperial Academic Society?" Relisha immediately said that this was not true. She does not think that they even thought about it when they wrote something. Julia, still smiling, said that she would have guessed that the Imperial Academic Society took its work incredibly seriously. Then she handed her the paper and told her to look at it carefully. The woman pointed to all those letters and said that at the very top is His Majesty. Right below him is the Empress's palace. They are also located in the palace of the princesses and princes. And the Imperial Academic Society is directly subordinate to the Administrative Bureau. She also pointed to the coat of arms that was at the very top, and said that it was the symbol of the Tagar imperial family. Julia also said that Count Rode is called the third lion of the empire, which means that His Majesty has limited faith in him. The first lion was a duke who commanded a powerful knightly order. The second lion died long ago, but His Majesty left the position vacant in his honor. In fact, Relisha, many years later, understands perfectly well that at 10 years old she was incredibly naive, and she studied absolutely everything that Julia told her, not knowing that this was precisely her goal. However, the few months that Relisha spent in the villa were the most peaceful months of her life. The girl finally felt like a child and learned what happiness was. After her mother's death, she played with Julia very often and learned many new things. But one day, when they were walking on the street, a carriage drove up to the estate, and a woman with bright red hair got out of it. Relisha was terribly frightened. She even let go of her nanny's hand and just looked at this woman in surprise who had just come up to them. Julia, when she saw this woman, immediately realized that it was Countess Roward. And this woman, looking angrily at Relisha, asked, "Is she really that very flower?" Of course, the beautiful girl had to understand that such happiness, which she found so suddenly, could not last long for an illegitimate child. And now, 7 whole years have passed since she first arrived. Relisha has already become a fully grown adult, and she lives in the Rode estate. At that time, she was already 17 years old, and she, as always, was sitting in her office, studying various textbooks and doing her homework. After the Countess brought her to the Rode estate, quite a few different events happened that greatly affected the girl. One day the Count realized that she now lived there and gave her a tour of the entire estate and the city. People immediately recognized her as the Count's daughter because of her physical resemblance to him. They were indeed incredibly similar, and so the news that Count Rode had brought an illegitimate child home with him quickly spread throughout the empire. Thanks to this, the Countess could not help but abandon the girl to death and simply kick her out of the estate. Later, this woman introduced Relisha to a new private tutor, saying that it was for her own good. But this tutor was completely different from Julia. Whenever the girl failed at something, he always called her names and said that she was a disgrace to the family, and also that he did not understand how she, being the daughter of a count, could not remember such a simple thing. In the end, Relisha concluded that it didn't take long for her life to go downhill again. This tutor, when he worked with her, always sighed heavily and said that the most noble ladies master this material at the age of 8. Therefore, he does not understand why she does not know these elementary things, and also cannot imagine what she did before this moment at all. He also blamed her late mother for all of this, not understanding what she had been doing all this time if she couldn't even teach her child basic things. He also said that it was quite strange, because Julia said that she was a capable student. But in the end, he didn't notice it at all. When Relisha became a little older, she finally couldn't resist asking whose fault it was, if only she had problems understanding his lessons. And with irritation in her voice, she asked her new tutor which of them was really disgracing the Count in this way. Of course, at that moment, her teacher's face turned red with anger, and he simply ran out of the room. And their next lesson began with the use of corporal punishment for the words she said to him. He asked Rolitsia incredibly difficult questions, and for every question she answered incorrectly, he hit her on the hands with a stick. At the age of 10, she could already understand that talking to him would definitely not lead to anything good, but would only worsen her already difficult situation. However, little did this man actually know that Rolitsia had learned all of his deepest secrets and was thus able to manipulate him. After another lesson, she asked her father to take a walk with her, because she knew very well that her teacher would again be hiding behind the estate with the maid. And so, that was the last time Rolitsia ever saw this teacher. But this freedom and happiness were again short-lived, because even at an advanced age, the Duchess still pestered her. While Rolitsia was sitting in her room reading various books, a woman suddenly burst into her room and asked, "Did she really take her things again?" The girl immediately closed the book and, looking at the Duchess in surprise, said that it was not her book at all, but the one who took it first received it. She also wondered why the woman was so angry, since she didn't read books at all, so she didn't see the need to worry so much about it. The woman came closer to her and asked how she dared to talk to her like that. She also called her uncultured names, and Rolitsia immediately said that it was a bit vulgar for a lady of the Roadhouse. The woman, who was the legitimate daughter of Earl Road, Misha, asked how she could call her vulgar at all. After that, she snatched the book from her hands and told her to just forget about it because it was a complete waste of time. Misha turned around and immediately left without saying anything else, and Rolitsia remained sitting, very surprised. In fact, the Countess and Misha could not stand the fact that the girl was an illegitimate child and lived on the family estate, and therefore their constant bullying was simply exhausting. But soon, Rolitsia was able to find a way to deal with this situation, and this solution turned out to be the Imperial Academy. She believed that if she could get there, then she could also get out of this house, because this academy was also a boarding school. And after finishing her studies, Rolitsia believed that she could make a successful career as a mentor in a noble family, so this option was the best for her. She would also be able to protect the Count's reputation and save herself at the same time. So entering this academy was more than a dream for her. Then suddenly Rolitsia, after receiving one letter, turned to Terry, her personal maid. She immediately came to the girl and asked, had she really stayed up late studying again, and because of that she hadn't gotten enough sleep? Rolitsia laughed and said that it was indeed so, because the exam at the academy was coming soon, and she shouldn't give in to weakness. The maid, meanwhile, was very surprised and said that she worked so hard. So she really hoped that she would still be able to enter this academy, because she, like no one else, deserved to be there. In fact, Rolitsia herself found it hard to understand the fact that the girl who used to earn her living with herbs was now preparing for an exam at a very prestigious academy. However, this was reality now, so she had to come to terms with it. After all, miracles do come true if you believe in them. Then suddenly the maid said that she had seen Lady Misha leaving with a book in her hand and asked, had she really taken the book from her again? Rolitsia said in a calm voice that it was so, and also asked if Littera could bring it back to her when the woman came out of there later. She explained this by saying that in a few hours, Misha wouldn't even remember that she had taken the book, so it would be useful for her. The maid, of course, agreed, and after that, they were in silence for a while. Rolitsia thought that this was the right decision, because she could not waste time hating anyone. She had to focus on herself and her goals first and then think about any competition. Her previous nanny returned immediately after the incident with the teacher, and Julia came to the girl, saying that there were only a few days left until the entrance exam to the academy. She smiled at the girl and also added that she had done very well on the history and math tests there, so she suggested that she focus on studying law, and also asked how her musical training was going there. Rolitsia, laughing nervously, said that if she failed the exam, it would probably be because of music, because she was not good at anything at all. But Julia, smiling, said that she still believed that the girl would be able to do everything possible until the end, so she should not give up. But before Julia left, Rolitsia said that the Count had said that if she needed or wanted anything, he would like to reward her for her hard work after completing the exam. But Julia at that moment smiled happily and said that there was no need for that, because she had already been sufficiently rewarded, and also asked how long she would continue to call him simply Count, because they had already lived together for so many years. Her nanny asked if it wasn't time to call him something else. Relicia didn't answer. She just changed the subject, and soon they said goodbye. When the girl began to return to her room, she had thoughts about this in her head all the time, but not at all happy ones. She thought that he was her father after all, and perhaps that was what she should call him. But when she returned to her room, she shook her head and realized that she couldn't just take and be distracted by all this, because she had more important things to do. Therefore, Relicia, approaching her desk, realized that she should think about this after she was accepted into the academy. Then she would be able to decide something for herself. But at that moment, she suddenly noticed that there was nothing in the place where her notebook usually lay. She immediately started looking in different places, but realized that it was nowhere to be found. This made her very wary, because she knew exactly where she had put it. But then, the girl suddenly remembered the existence of her half-sister Misha and realized that this was probably her doing. She thought that this girl was definitely crazy, and when she found pink hair under the table, she immediately concluded that it was definitely her. When evening came, Relicia learned that Misha's mother had called her to her place, and when she arrived, she saw that she, in turn, was sitting at a small dining table and drinking afternoon tea. Misha's mother didn't even react at all to the fact that her sister came to her. She just ignored her, as if the girl didn't exist at all. Of course, the boundaries and all this was not very pleasant. She did not understand what to do now, but she said hello because it was the girl who called her. And after some time, she finally spoke, saying that she had been studying very hard in the last few days. Relicia smiled nervously and said that it really wasn't that hard. She always did it, so she didn't see anything surprising in it. At that moment, Misha's mother put her cup of tea on the table and asked, "Is this really what she thinks?" After not receiving a response from her, the woman also said that her daughter had been crying for hours that day and asked what had happened between them. Relicia immediately panicked and replied that it was a stressful time, so it was understandable that the girl was nervous and crying. Continuing to look at her, she asked if she knew that she had stolen her notebook. Relicia, hearing about this, was very surprised, but did not answer the woman, and the Duchess replied that Misha took this notebook only to use it as a cheat and hints during the exams with the tutor. Of course, the girl was incredibly surprised by the behavior of the Duchess, because she could not understand why she interfered in their situation at all. But Relicia then said that she didn't know that she stole her notebook. But after that, she replied that she wouldn't mind lending Misha her laptop if it could help her in her studies. Then the Duchess, with a smile on her face, replied that the teachers were very impressed with the contents of the girl's notebook. She also said that they thought the Duchess had hired more tutors because it looked so wonderful that it seemed like she hadn't thought of it herself. And then the woman asked if Julia had helped her with all this. Relicia, hearing about this, was very surprised, but she did not have time to answer, because the woman, turning to her, told her not to take the entrance exams to the academy. The girl was incredibly surprised to hear about this. She was about to object, but the Duchess continued and said that if she said that she could not do this, then her father would understand everything. The woman stood up from her seat and said that this was no longer just her personal business, and also asked if she had thought about what an insult this would be for the children of prestigious noble families. She believed that if an illegitimate child were to score high on the academy entrance exam, it would be a great shame for everyone. The Duchess continued to insist on her own, and even said that it was about maintaining order, so Relicia needed to seriously think about whose side she was on and stop thinking only about herself. The girl was incredibly shocked. Her hands even began to shake. She replied that she would definitely discuss this issue with his lordship to find out his personal position on this issue, and then she would make some kind of decision. But the Duchess, coming closer to her, said that she did not think it was a good idea, because she would like to resolve this issue as quietly as possible without attracting unnecessary attention to herself. When Relicia heard this, she immediately started yelling at her, but the girl tried to calm her down, telling her not to be so upset because she was not trying to force her. If the girl really wanted to pass the exam, then she could, of course, do it. But at that moment, she looked her adopted daughter in the eyes and said that even if she did manage to pass this exam, she would not be able to attend the academy for long. She explained this assumption by the fact that the girl would be expelled for one reason or another, but she certainly wouldn't be able to stay there for long. After all, no one wants to have a prostitute's daughter as a classmate. Of course, such statements towards her mother and herself made Relisha very angry. She started shouting at the woman, saying that her mother had done a lot of good, and the Duchess knew it very well. The woman acted as if she could solve absolutely any problem without even straining herself, and said that, of course, she knew everything perfectly well. But after that, she added that the rumors say something completely different, and Relisha, of course, will not be able to do anything with the opinions of others, because they always believe others. Relisha could no longer stand it. She began to shout at the Duchess, asking how she could say such a thing. After all, the reputation of the House of Rhoda would suffer, and his lordship would appear in a bad light in front of people. The girl also said that she herself knows that the Count is a decent man, and she does not understand whether she can still brazenly lie to everyone like that. Then the Duchess came closer to her and said in a cold voice that of course it was so, she could certainly do it. After that, she tapped her on the shoulder and, walking forward, said that if she could protect her daughter from injury, she would definitely gladly allow her husband's reputation to be destroyed. Before leaving, the woman also said that Relisha would be known as a prostitute's daughter for the rest of her life, and no matter how hard she tried, the controversial family would not be able to hire her as a tutor. Therefore, she absolutely should not have such a foolish dream. And the Duchess also said that even if this ever happened, she was going to do absolutely everything in her power to prevent it, because, in her opinion, she did not deserve this position at all. The woman believed that if she could not receive her husband's love, then she would try with all her might to make him feel pain. When the next day came, Relisha went to the market early in the morning and went into a small shop that sold various herbs and medicines. The girl knew the salesman very well. He was also the owner of the drugstore. His name was Tolman. As soon as the man saw who had come to see him, he immediately smiled, and greeting her, said that he was incredibly glad to see her again. Tolman then added that she had said she could not come for some time, and asked if her visit meant she was finally ready to work for him. But Relisha, coming closer to him, said that this was not at all the case, and she simply decided to stop by on the way. The girl also asked how his colleagues were doing. He waved his hand and replied that everything was the same as always. After this, Relisha bowed and said that she would go now. She had little time left. Tolman, hearing this, was very surprised because she had only just arrived and asked her to stay a little longer. But the girl, opening the door and leaving, also heard that he asked her to work for him. He also said that he would pay her well, if only she would agree to this position. But the girl, of course, did not agree. She walked along dark alleys and realized that she was completely lost in her soul, and even the smell of her favorite herbs did not make her feel any better, but only brought back sad memories from the past. Of course, Relisha was incredibly upset because she worked so hard to enter this academy, but fate apparently decided to play a bad joke on her. Before she went further, she suddenly stopped, and looking at the moon, thought that in the end, her efforts were simply in vain, and she would not even be able to attend the exam. She was incredibly upset by all of this, and the girl did not understand how much longer this would continue. Relisha was also interested in how much time the Countess planned to do all of this. She even suggested that she had probably been watching Relisha study all night long for months and was waiting for the last moment to set her up like this. Of course, she got very angry and even cursed in a quiet voice, but then suddenly she heard someone talking nearby. She immediately turned her head in their direction. Then she saw some guy holding an innocent girl by the hand, hurting her. He looked her straight in the eyes and asked what she was saying, but when she didn't answer, he said that he asked her questions, demanded an answer. This unfortunate lady tried to pull her hand away from him and asked him why he was doing this at all, and also asked him to leave her alone and let her go. Relisha, when she saw this situation, was very angry. She knew that he looked noble, but he looked quite normal, and she could not believe that he no longer had a better occupation than just going around pestering women. It irritated her that such horrible men were allowed to join the academy, and she knew that it was precisely such people who would eventually destroy their empire with their boorish and unceremonious behavior on the streets and with people. So, without thinking twice, she came closer and asked if he really wanted to know what she said. This guy immediately turned to his girlfriend, who he was talking to, and told her to forget about it and just do other things, and also to get away from them and not bother them. But Relisha, staying put, said that she loved her neighbors as much as she loved herself, so she couldn't just leave like that. She also wondered why he didn't just let the girl go, since she asked him to do so. He in turn, continuing to wave his hand, said that her courage was worthy of praise, but it had nothing to do with her, so he would very much ask her to remove her stupid remarks and just leave. Of course, this made Relisha even more angry. She ran up to him and asked, how can she just leave? She could break his wrist for this. And also asked, do his parents even know that he walks around the street and terrorizes other women? Of course, the guy did not expect such assertiveness from the girl. He already wanted to do something to her, but did not have time because the lady he was holding by the hand at that moment managed to get out and began to run away, joyfully screaming. The guy immediately started running after her, saying that this girl was running away, but Relisha grabbed his hand, thereby stopping him. She said that she didn't understand where he was going because she hadn't finished yet. At that moment, they both started arguing and trying to stop each other, but the girl had already calmly run away. But just as the girl was about to turn the corner and run even further, she suddenly stopped because a man in uniform appeared right in front of her. She immediately screamed loudly because he grabbed her wrist with one hand and pulled her to the side, thereby taking something from her pocket. The relic, who had been resisting the man until now, immediately turned to the side to see what was going on. And the guy at that moment immediately let go of the girl and ran up to his commander, took the piece of paper that he had taken from her, and the commander in turn said that she had probably hidden it under her clothes. Relisha immediately became very scared. She understood that this piece of paper turned out to be a wallet, and it was expensive, so now she concluded that this man, with whom she had recently resisted, had simply had his wallet stolen. He immediately opened it and began to count whether all the money was in place, and Relisha felt a little ashamed, because she understood that this girl had taken advantage of her sympathy only in order to escape and remain unnoticed. Relisha, not knowing how to treat an innocent man as a pervert, stood in his way, although he just wanted to take his thing. Of course, her life had never prepared her for such cases, but she immediately looked at him and thought that perhaps these men were robbing her right now. But, looking more closely at the expression on the girl's face, she realized that this was certainly not the case, because she was incredibly angry and upset because she had failed. When the boy had counted all his money, he turned to Relisha and asked her if she now saw that she had been wrong to try to stop him, even though he was completely innocent. Yes, the girl knew that she would now be scolded, so without thinking twice, she immediately began to run away towards her estate. He, of course, was very surprised by her reaction and was about to run after her, but his commander stopped him, saying that he was not going anywhere. Then another man came up behind them, wearing a different uniform and a cape, so it was impossible to see his face. He turned to the guy's commander and told him to leave her alone. The man immediately turned towards him, very surprised. He already wanted to say something, but eventually realized that it was best to let the girl go. Then she quickly started to run away, and he told her that she was just very lucky, but next time she better not run into them. After this, the men bowed and asked him if he was enjoying his walk. These men turned out to be the second prince of Tagar, and his name was Grayat. He smiled nervously and said that he had not really enjoyed the walk because everything had not turned out as he had expected. After that, he turned his gaze to his first escort and said that he was so fast that he could hardly keep up with him. The guy smiled, turned his head to the side, and said that he was pretty fast before he reached freedom, so not everyone would be able to catch up with him. Grayat suddenly noticed that his assistant, whose name was Kadal, was looking somewhere, and immediately asked why he couldn't take his eyes off of it. The man, continuing to look back, did not answer. In fact, he was looking in the direction where Relisha had run off to. However, when the second prince began to pester him, He said that they should just go back before something bad happened. Meanwhile, the girl had already managed to run to her estate. She quickly changed her clothes and immediately lay down on the bed, because these night adventures had tired her out very much. For some time, the girl lay on the bed completely silently and only laughed at the whole situation that happened to her. Now that she was completely safe, she realized that it was even funny. She was wearing a hood, so of course the men couldn't see her face or figure out who she was. And she also knew that the only chance she had to meet another noble was if she entered the academy. However, now that he was gone, she would never be able to see someone of the same status again. At that moment, Relisha was simply in a panic and understood what was the point of worrying about it now if she no longer had any future. She was simply deprived of all chances for something normal. She laughed for a while longer, but then, having calmed down, she did not understand what she should say to the Count about this, so that he would not suspect anything bad, because if something went wrong, the Duchess would be furious. But at that moment, someone knocked on Relisha's door. She immediately sat up on the bed and asked who it was. A male voice answered that it was him. The girl immediately realized that it was her father and said that, of course, he could come in. The man, coming closer, said that she had looked unwell for the last few days, so he asked if she was sick. The girl smiled and said that of course it wasn't like that and she was perfectly fine, so he shouldn't worry. He then breathed a sigh of relief and said that in that case, on tomorrow's exam, she should just do what she always did, without worrying at all about the results that would come out in the end, because even if they weren't the best, it was still okay. Relisha smiled and said that, of course, she understood all this perfectly well and was grateful to him for his support. Then, after a short silence, her father said that since she would soon be of age, she should have a debutante ball before entering the academy. He explained that it was better to do it late than never, because the academy is a tough social environment in which such events are important. Of course, Relisha was very surprised when she heard this, but she didn't know what to do now, so she was silent for a while, but then she said that, of course, she had to arrange it. But after that, the girl replied that she was not too sure whether she was good enough to enter the best academy in the empire, so she did not want to disappoint him. Her father then, sighing heavily, stroked her head and told her to go to bed now so that she could get up early tomorrow. He also said that he would personally take her to the exam place in the morning. She had no choice but to agree. She herself thought that this was indeed right. She did not need to tell the Count that she would not take this exam. He should think as if everything was fine. In that case, he would simply assume that she had failed it. And later she could tell him that she was too anxious to pass it, and then suggest that she retake it next year. Of course, Relisha was still young. It was difficult for her to independently solve all the problems that the world was throwing at her head. She considered it impossible, but the next day a carriage with her father drove up to the annex of her imperial palace to take her directly to the exam. Because of very strong emotions and various thoughts, she was unable to fall asleep, so in the morning she was like a squeezed lemon. Of course, Misha was supposed to go with them, so she soon came there and talked about something with her father. Relisha didn't like all this, but soon they arrived at the territory where the exam was to be taken, and she saw how a cart with some familiar flag also drove up there. The girl assumed that most likely someone from the Cadell house also decided to take this exam at the academy. She knew that it was probably Duke Kaidol, the first lion of the empire, because he was just the right age. Before the girl had time to think about anything or make a suggestion, Misha suddenly turned to her and asked what she was thinking about, and also said that they needed to hurry up and go inside, because that way they would be late for the exam. Relisha was angry about all this. She couldn't believe that the girl had decided to just make fun of her right in front of her father because, of course, she, like no one else, knew that she couldn't pass this exam. But when she saw the carefree expression on Misha's face, who was worried before the exam, she assumed that most likely the Duchess did not tell her about her plan, which surprised the girl very much. Well, she understood why the Countess didn't do it, because she was ready to do anything just to protect her daughter. Relisha suddenly felt a little sad because she remembered her mother, who of course would do absolutely everything to make her happy and would continue to fight with all her might. The girl was about to go forward after her sister, but she didn't have time, because her father put his hand on her shoulder and looked straight into her eyes, trying to encourage her. He smiled. She immediately nodded her head and smiled back at him. Thus, they understood each other. He supported her, and the girl accepted this support and soon went to the territory where the exam was to be held. Later, Relisha was going to hide in the territory while the Duke was not looking, and then everything would fall into place, as it should be. She walked down the street with her head down, and thought that the reputation of the Countess and the reputation of the Count, as well as the reputation of her mother, all this will be as it should be. It will be preserved because the girl will sacrifice her future. But it was worth it in her opinion. When evening came and the exams were already over, Relisha went to her friend's shop. Many visitors came there. One of the women even asked if they had goralid leaves. Relisha was very happy to help Telman and said that of course they had it, and asked the random woman if she was looking for a hangover cure. Coming closer to her, she asked if she could offer the woman a medicine that would be compatible with this. The visitor immediately became happy and asked what she could offer her. And Relisha replied that this medicine probably worked best when used in combination with another. So she began offering her various options so that she would have a choice. When the owner of this shop saw the girl in action, he immediately became happy and, smiling, thought that she was simply made for this job. He also asked if she really didn't want to take over his job. Relisha thought at that moment that for so long her only dream was to become a tutor. However, getting experience working in a shop and opening her own shop was also a good idea. Therefore, the girl replied that she was still not sure about working for him, but from now on she would come to him as often as possible, because she liked it herself. Telman immediately laughed and said that he would not mind if she visited his place often. Then, in the end, she would want to work, and then everyone would win. But at that moment, someone suddenly knocked on the shop door. The man was very surprised and did not understand why there were so many carriages on that day. After all, when he looked out the window, he saw that there really were a lot of them driving past. At that moment, Relisha thought that the exam was probably already over, and with a trembling voice, she said that it was time for her to go. The man smiled and said that there was no problem with that, and also told her to come tomorrow and show good results when she was there. Closing the door behind her, the girl said that she couldn't. Would she have time to come tomorrow? But she would definitely come back. And so a whole week passed from that moment. Finally, the exam results were ready, and Misha happily opened the letter and read hers. She immediately screamed loudly and said that she had managed to pass this exam. Her mother, hugging her, replied that it was just wonderful and also that she knew that she would succeed. Her father immediately laughed at that moment and said that it was really very good and that he was proud of her. Relisha was sitting on a chair at that moment and simply watched all this with a smile on her face. In fact, she would never have thought that the Countess could behave truly and sincerely happily. She thought that she should probably leave already, so as not to torment herself even more. So, getting up from her seat, she headed for the exit. Of course, Relisha wasn't even going to open her envelope, because she knew perfectly well what would be in there. So she didn't want to ruin such a happy moment. At that moment, her father noticed that she was leaving very sad. He felt even sadder because of this. He understood perfectly well that everything had not gone as they had expected. That same evening, after all the joyful cries had finally died down, he came into Relisha's room, and when he saw her lying sadly at her desk, he patted her on the shoulder. The man smiled encouragingly when she looked at him and said that next year the house would be quiet, so she would be able to concentrate on her studies much better and would definitely pass this exam with honors. He also said that he should call the tutors who taught Misha this year so that they would start teaching her too. When Relisha heard this, she became very worried and then replied that Julia was not at all to blame for this. She did nothing wrong. It was just such a bad day. Of course, at some point, the girl wanted to tell her father the whole truth, but she understood that she couldn't do it. So she kept silent and just looked at the wall with a surprised look. This made the Duke even sadder. He put his hand on her head and said that absolutely everything in this life has its time. And just because it didn't happen this time doesn't mean Relisha has failed forever. The girl became very sad. She, lowering her head down, suddenly asked if he was going to give her an inheritance. When he heard this, he was immediately surprised and asked what she was saying. And the girl, without raising her head, answered that she had to understand how much she needed to save in order to start her own business. This was exactly what she wanted to do. When her father didn't answer, Relisha asked him for forgiveness and told him to just pretend he hadn't heard all of this, because she knew that his reaction was not good at all. The man didn't react to this at all. He started to leave and told her to take a little rest, and after that they would return to this conversation. When the door closed, Relisha breathed a sigh of relief and thought that she had simply lost her mind. She did not understand how she could have said such unpleasant words to the Count at all. But before the girl could even breathe out, the door suddenly opened again, without even knocking, and a joyful Misha ran into the room. Of course, the girl was not at all happy about her appearance, but when her stepsister came closer to her, she immediately asked if she wanted to tell her anything. Relisha forced herself to smile and said that she really wanted to congratulate her on passing the exam. At that moment, Misha raised her head up and said, smiling happily, that it was nothing at all, because the Roadhouse was a family of intellects after all. The girl asked if her sister knew that it was her father's intelligence that once pulled their family out of a huge crisis. Relisha replied that she understood everything perfectly. In fact, despite the fact that it is not always very correct to listen to Misha, the girl also once heard this very interesting story. This was a time when the previous Earl of Rode was essentially living in exile in his domain because he had offended the emperor. And judging by the chronology, this should have happened exactly when the Count met Relicia's mother. But in the end, in order to avoid political isolation, he had no choice but to marry the daughter of a very rich nobleman, whom the emperor loved. And it was for this reason that the girl was now next to the Duchess and Misha, people who simply hated her. After a short silence, Misha said that she saw her results. They said that her grade was 0 in the end. Relicia, smiling nervously, said that she had learned from her own experience, so she must have been looking at the wrong course, which is why she had failed the exam. But Misha immediately said that, of course, everyone was very surprised when she didn't pass anything. After all, when the tutors saw her notebook with all these notes, they were stunned by the amount of knowledge the girl possessed. So, of course, no one even doubted that she would pass this exam with an excellent result. So Misha, with a very serious expression on her face, asked whether she had even passed this exam form. Relicia at this point moved away from her and told her to keep it to herself, because she would be humiliated if anyone ever found out about it. In the end, she actually told her about the whole situation that happened between her and her stepmother. Misha, having heard this whole story, was very surprised. She could not believe that her mother was really involved in this, and she also said that it was completely expected that she would take some measures. The girl also said that she knew how much Relisha wanted to go to the academy, so she said that the girl could get out of this house and live in the dorm anyway. When Relisha heard these words, she was angry. She wanted to curse at her half-sister, but she didn't, thinking that it would only make things worse. Misha, in turn, continued to make herself out to be a victim, and asked if she was at least blaming her for this. Since she had not asked her mother about this at all, she had no idea that the Duchess was capable of such an act. Closing her eyes, the girl sighed heavily and said that since she was feeling bad, she wanted to give her one gift. Then Misha replied that several years before Relicia came to this place, her mother began sending letters to this house. The sister at this point responded that her mother had burned them all behind her father's back, and she had used her connections to make the people her father had sent to look for Relicia's mother lie that they hadn't found her. So, in conclusion, the girl said that it was a real mystery how her father still managed to track down Relicia despite all this. But no matter what, she still wishes that her father did not neglect her intentionally, and she thinks that he is a little disappointed that she keeps her distance from him like this. So Misha asked her to take at least a few steps towards him, because she knows very well that he is very sentimental, and also added that she should under no circumstances tell anyone this information. Misha also said that she was telling her about this only in honor of the fact that their life together had finally ended. And as soon as she entered the academy, they would no longer have to see each other. Also, her half-sister, before leaving, said that she had pissed on Gala, that she did not feel a little pity because of all this. When Relicia heard this, She was very surprised. The girl thought about how a few years ago, when she started returning home from the village covered in blood, her mother probably thought that she couldn't continue raising her in such an unhealthy environment for a child. And she was afraid that if she suddenly died somehow, then Relicia would no longer have anyone who could take care of her, and care was incredibly necessary. And for this reason, she contacted the Count, despite the great risks, but received no answer. She continued to do this for several years anyway, until she finally had to give up, realizing that there would be no result. And as a sign that she would no longer look for him, her mother decided to send him a bouquet of Relicia, which was tied with a ribbon, his only gift for women.